Good afternoon. How are we doing this afternoon? If you're doing well, come on, put your hands together. As I introduce myself, I'm Reverend Dr. Charlie Haynes Jr. I'm the senior pastor here at Beebe Memorial Cathedral. For some of you all who listen to 102.9 KBLX, this is the voice that you hear when you hear a person says, life is a cathedral experience. I'm so grateful and thankful today that we have two powerhouse of women who not only represent us in the seat of Congress, but all over this country advocating for our needs. So I welcome you here to Beebe Memorial Cathedral. I'm so grateful that they chose this venue and this place to have this particular conversation. I'm so grateful today to introduce a friend of mine. I have known her literally since 2004. She's been not only an advocate for politics, but she has a passion for people. She is the founder and president of She the People, and she believes that the strongest voice in politics is that of a woman. So let's receive this amazing phenom, the person of Aimee Allison.
Thank you. Round of applause for the pastor and for Beebe Memorial Cathedral for hosting us here today. Thank you. I am so honored to be with you today and to be in conversation with two of the leading lights of our nation. You know, if you followed the Twitter stream, you can get pretty depressed about the times that we're in. And I feel completely honored in my work with She the People to see women of color stepping fully into their fierce and loving leadership and collective power. The public conversation that we have today and that we're having across the country is making a difference. Just a couple of months ago, She the People held the first forum, presidential forum, focused on women of color at Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas. Out of all the things that happened, out of all the stories that were generated, there was over 5,000. Out of the fact that all the tweets that we inspired, we were trending #1 on that day. The country learned something very important about women of color. We are a powerful voting bloc, and that no one will win the presidency, no Democrat wins Congress or Senate without our enthusiastic support at the polls. What's more, at that presidential forum, we were able to introduce very critical issues to the national consciousness and political conversation. Black maternal health, the crisis of Black moms dying in hospitals, and what we're going to do about that. Abortion access and health care. How do we protect our right to choose, particularly for women of color and low-income women? And third, what do we do to protect our communities from the rise of white nationalist violence? The reason those are so critical is because today we are honored to meet and talk to two leaders who are leading on those issues and more. The progressive movement, the movement of people in the streets, is reflected in these women leaders who are in DC fighting for us every day. And first I want to introduce both of them, but one is our own Congress member, the only Black woman in Democratic Party leadership who has been so instrumental for decades in leading the progressive movement, our own Congresswoman, Barbara Lee. Barbara Lee still speaks for me, you know what I'm saying? And then we are so honored to welcome from Massachusetts, from Boston, the freshman Congresswoman and fierce voice in Congress, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. Please welcome her to Oakland. We have so much to learn about the journey that both members of Congress have had, and I want to say we're going to cover a lot of ground, and you're in the conversation too. So we're going to have begin our conversation, and then staff is going to hand out cards. I want you to write down your questions, and then hand them to me, and we'll integrate those into our conversation here today. So let's begin with our own Congresswoman. I just, you have been such a stalwart for the progressive movement. You're a familiar face to those of us who live in Oakland, but just tell me, how did you get, tell us about your path to getting into elected leadership all those years ago. I know, you gotta go back.
Yeah. You're really dating me. Aimee, first, thank you so much for doing this for us today and for your tremendous leadership. And I tell you, Aimee Allison is changing the face of politics in the whole country. So thank you. And to Pastor Hames and our First Lady, Michelle, thank you so much for opening this beautiful cathedral. You know, I have a special affinity and love for Beebe. I just have to share this very quickly. Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, of course, my mentor, visited Beebe Memorial right here, spoke right here from this pulpit twice. So did Senator Kennedy. And so this sanctuary holds a lot of history and is very, very special to me, and I feel their spirit today. So thank you so much. And to my sister, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, I just have to thank you once again for traveling so far and challenges flying out here, but she made it, and she is an unbelievable, progressive African-American woman who comes to Congress with experience and with life experience. And I just have to say this, because I'm saying this everywhere I go about Ayanna, how effective she is, and this is just in the last couple of weeks. She, first of all, last week, we were marking up and getting our appropriations bills passed, and so Ayanna decided that she was going to add more funds to the school-based health clinic account. And guess what? She came to the floor, had a $5 million add-on, and it passed. And it was just remarkable. And then during and I mentioned this also, I served on the Homeland Security Conference Committee. I was the only African American on that conference committee, and that was the committee that moved forward to set the parameters for opening the government up. And so many people lost so much during that shutdown. And Ayanna, even though she wasn't on the conference committee, she championed the rights of contract workers for back pay because they were precluded. Well, Senator Shelby and others, you know, we have others on that conference committee who wouldn't go for it, and so we couldn't quite get it in. But last week, again, Ayanna comes forward with an amendment to include back pay for contract workers, and guess what? That passed also. So that just shows you how effective the sister is. And those are only two examples that are very recent to me. So I'm really happy that you're here, and she has just been unbelievable in terms of leading, quite frankly, the squad. We have now the squad who I am so happy that they're in Congress. Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, and of course AOC. Now those, so this squad is like, it's a breath of fresh air for me. You don't know. Maxine and I are so happy. And you can be, and so I want everyone to get to know Ayanna and the squad so that we can support their efforts as they move forward, because they are truly leaders already in Congress. And of course, we know as an African-American woman, going to face challenges each and every election for a couple of times, but beyond that, It's good. So I got involved in politics when I was a student at Mills College, and I was president of Black Student Union, and I was a community worker with the Black Panther Party here. All right, power to the people. And I was in a class, I've only had one course in government in my life, and this course requirement was not only doing the academic work in the class, but also working in a campaign in a field capacity. And so Dr. Mullins told us we could work in any of the campaigns, any of the presidential campaigns. And it was McGovern, Muskie, Humphrey. I said, flunk me. You know, I've never flunked a class, but no way am I gonna do this. Now, I had a big afro, I was on public assistance, had 2 little boys. I drugged them to class with me because I couldn't afford childcare. And so I didn't believe that, I didn't see these candidates speaking to the issues that I cared about, or my community cared about, or the women cared about. And so I just said, flunk me. And I was very clear about why I was not registered to vote. It was, you know, it was like the party, Democratic Party, the government had no relationship to my daily life, and so I didn't need to play around with that. I was a revolutionary, and I was gonna make some systemic change, some revolutionary change, and that's who I was. So Shirley Chisholm comes to campus as the first African-American woman elected to Congress. I actually invited her as president of the Black Student Union. She came and she spoke and she said she was running for president. I couldn't believe it. I went up afterwards and talked to her, and she took me to task because I told her I was about to flunk this class. And she asked me if I was registered to vote. I said, heavens no, not me. You know, power to the people. I literally told her that. Yeah. No, we're the church, though. We're the church. Yeah, and I had on my jeans and t-shirt and bear, so yeah, you know what I said. So, she knows how I talk, so. And so finally she convinced me. Now let me just tell you, Shirley Chisholm spoke fluent Spanish. She talked about immigrant rights. She was against the Vietnam War. She was pro-choice. She talked about poverty. She was an educator. And she talked about public education. All the issues that I cared about, she talked about in her speech. And so that's why I went up and told her about this class. So she took me to task, told me I better register to vote. And I said, well, maybe, but let me think about it. I said, I just want to pass this class. But she said, no, little girl, even though I was about 21, she said, you've got to get involved, she said, because if you don't have a seat at the table, you know, your voice, you know, they're gonna, you know, not recognize you at all. So you need to get on the inside, not to play along to get along, but not to play by their rules to get along and go along. She said, but you've got to get in there and change those rules of the game. And so you got to get involved in politics. So I went back and told and she said she didn't have a campaign up here because she didn't have a lot of money. Went back, told my professor, and my professor said, well, you figure out how to get involved. That's the point of the class. You've got to do this. So I went to Sandre Swanson, who was student body president at Laney College, Wilson Riles Jr., who was on the city council in Oakland. Well, no, he was a student then, but he was very active with the Black Panther Party. And I went to Sandy Gaines, who was student body president. So bottom line is all of us organized Shirley Chisholm's Northern California campaign out of my course at Mills College. I got an A in the class. We took 9% or 10% of the vote in Alameda County, and I went to Miami as a Shirley Chisholm delegate. So the rest is history. Yeah, and throughout my life in Washington, D.C. with our great fallen leader, Ron Dellums, who we miss tremendously, Shirley mentored me because there were only about two African American women as chief of staffs on Capitol Hill. And that was myself and Shirley's chief of staff. So she taught me the ropes in Washington, D.C. and helped me tremendously. Came back, when I campaigned for office, came back here twice when I ran for the Assembly, once when I ran for the Senate, and then for Congress. So she's helped me and been my mentor, and I miss her tremendously.
Oh, what a story. And it just, you know, when I think about this trajectory and then you coming into Congress in your own path, was it Shirley Chisholm that inspired you? What drew you in? And you also had to challenge in the Democratic Party for your place on the ballot. Tell us about what drew you to the race.
Well, the most formidable influence in my life was and remains my mother, my shero, may she rest in power. She gave me my roots and my wings, and she modeled service and activism. My mother held many jobs to make ends meet, but she told me early in life that there was, for most, a difference between your job and your work. Your job is what you did to pay the rent, but your work was your life's work. And for my mother, that work was the work of community empowerment, mobilization, upliftment, and advancement. I'm very fortunate that my job and my work are one and the same. And I get to actualize my shared values with warriors for social, racial, economic, gender, green justice, like Barbara Lee. And I know it is very par for the course for elected officials to say, and that is my friend, but I'm gonna tell you the truth, they don't usually mean it. From every fiber of my being, from my toes to the top of my head, I have so much love, respect, and admiration for this woman. And she is a mentor, both by her example and in a very hands-on way, to many members. So it started for me with my mother. She didn't read me nursery rhymes. She told me tales of Black liberation and talked to me about Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm. Those were my bedtime stories. And I'm an only child. My mother, like many families, our household was impacted by mass incarceration, and my father, who was a brilliant man and handsome too, who would want me to tell you that, he battled substance abuse disorder and addiction and was in and out of the criminal justice system for about 14 years. He's now a published author and a professor of journalism. But when he was in the throes, yes, please. And you know, both my mother and I are survivors of childhood sexual abuse and also rape. And so, you know, what I was living every day was intergenerational poverty, trauma, poor public health outcomes, living and existing in the residual aftermath of redlining, which still exists, so-called welfare reform, the war on drugs. And as I grew older, I realized that you did not need signage to know when you were entering a low-income or community of color or a Black community, because the markers were all the same. Limited access to transit, which is a social justice issue. Little equity in home ownership, a density of liquor stores, and processed food. And I just really came to realize that we were living in these conditions because they were created by policy. And so it was my contention and position that if these inequities and disparities were created by policy, and these policies were created by man, then they can and should be disrupted by this woman. And so that's why I went to Washington, to intentionally and holistically, with an intersectional lens, disrupt these disparate outcomes that exist throughout our country. But in my district, the Massachusetts 7th, in a 3-mile radius from Cambridge to Roxbury, life expectancy drops by 30 years and median household income by $50,000. And these inequities were put into motion long before one man descended an escalator at Trump Tower. We will officially observe Juneteenth on Wednesday, but throughout the country, including in my home state of the Commonwealth and here today in Oakland, people are celebrating Juneteenth today. But we know we are not fully free, and there is much work that remains to be done. So the long answer is, I'm here because of my mama, because of her example. And what I wanted to share with you is that I was my mother's caregiver in her final battle with leukemia. And she knew she wasn't going to beat it that time, but I was in complete denial. And I learned later that she had been creating a journal for me in the final days of her life before she transitioned. And I found that upon her transition. And the last 2 tabs of this notebook, she very lovingly and thoughtfully created for me, said, "For inspiration," and they were the printed speeches of Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm. Wow. And so, but fast forward, so I'm originally from Chicago, came to Boston to attend school, yes, the Chi, I was a student at Boston University, president of my college, and I organized the Martin Luther King Day celebration and declared that I was going to invite 2 members of Congress, Barney Frank and Joe Kennedy, and that I was going to secure an internship with one of them before it was over. And I don't care who sees this, Barney Frank scared the hell out of me. He was a complete curmudgeon. You know, that's sort of his thing. And and Joe Kennedy was working on the issue of redlining. And so he hired me for an internship, and I use that loosely because this is the first Congress in history that interns are getting paid a living wage. And that matters because it's been a barrier to access for a long time. So I worked 3 paid jobs to do an unpaid internship. And ultimately, Congressman Joseph P. Kennedy II hired me as a constituent services liaison. I was focused on Social Security, so our most vulnerable seniors, veterans, making sure that people got benefits they'd been denied. And then I went on from there to work for United States Senator John Kerry for 11 years. And then I ran and was elected to the Boston City Council. Now, Boston's a very tribal, parochial place, so it's not easy to get elected outright if you're not a legacy. You don't have someone who was in office, you know, ahead of you, your family. I mean, I came here not knowing a soul, you know, and built a life and hopefully made a contribution. And so I have the sad edict of being the first woman of color elected to the Boston City Council. It took over 100 years. And so after serving on the council for 8 years, after much prayer and consultation with people in community, made the decision to run for Congress. Now, I challenged a 20-year incumbent, you know, and I never thought I was better. I wasn't raised that way, but I believed I had something different to contribute, and that these times really required activist leadership, and that the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power, driving and informing policymaking. And so here's a district that's 53% people of color, 40% foreign-born, 3rd largest LGBTQIA population in the country, 40% single female-headed households. And I had been on the Boston City Council 8 years, 3 election cycles as the top vote getter. And people thought it was audacious that I was running. I mean, you know. And so I'm here, the same reason Barbara Lee is here, because neither of us were raised to ask permission to lead.
Yeah. I was thinking when you were talking about how we're watching you on television, we see you both on Facebook. We're in an environment where people are being put in what they're calling the doghouse or cages at the border, migrants. We see out-and-out attacks on communities. We see corruption that at the level that was never obvious to me, at least in my lifetime. And then we see you, both of you. And I wonder what it's like for you. I mean, personally. Often we say, and I certainly in my work, encourage women of color who are the least likely to be elected. And a lot of times we're challenged in the Democratic Party, by the Democratic Party in primaries, so we never make it onto the ballot. But when we do get into office, what's it like? I want to know what it is to be a Black woman at this time, really fighting anti-democratic fascist forces. They're trying to take over our country. What's it like for you?
First of all, it's an honor and a privilege to be able to stand in the gap, because what we see taking place now in this country, I am convinced It's black women and women of color who are going to be able to save the soul of America. Okay, I'm convinced of that because of who we are, because of our history, and because of our commitment and our brilliance. Secondly, it can get kind of lonely because you're fighting oftentimes within your party structure, and you're fighting on the outside for your constituents. You're fighting for systemic change. You're fighting for funding. I mean, you're constantly in a battle for something. But who better than women of color to fight that battle? I mean, this is who we are. But we're also putting forward our ideas because we have a seat at the table, and we're saying, no, no, no. We don't want to tinker around the edges, for example, on education. We want to increase funding for public education, not put more money into vouchers. Or we're at the table, right? We're at the table saying that. We're at the table saying that, no, 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 we don't want to put more money into mass incarceration and into our prison system. We'd rather put more money into drug treatment, prevention, economic growth, jobs, and into policies and initiatives that will help everyone live the American dream. So you have women of color saying that when others may be going in a different direction. And so it's standing in that gap that we do. And personally, for me, you know, I have two sons, great sons who were raised, again, as a single mother. I have 5 grandchildren who text me and call me day and night, all the time, want to know what I'm doing now, what city I'm in, when are they going to see me, what, you know, so it's really kind of fun working with them through technology, but I always can't wait to see them. And so that's kind of my personal life. But I'll close by just saying I'm like Ayanna, and when we met, we first talked about our mothers, because my mother, Pastor Hames, you know, she wouldn't go to church on Mother's Day because her mother passed, and it was very difficult for her. I have not been back to church since my mother passed either, because I just can't do it on Mother's Day. But the first time she went since her mother passed was right here. Because I spoke, you asked me to speak on Mother's Day, and she was sitting right over there, and that was the first time. So it was really, you remember that? It was like maybe a year or two before she passed. But my mother, and so she was a phenomenal woman. And I think what keeps me going on a personal level is her story. Because when she was born, part of her story, when she was pregnant with me, and when she was in labor, she needed a C-section, actually. And she went to the hospital, and the hospital would not admit her. This was in El Paso, Texas, and they would not admit her. And I'm thinking now these rules based on religious preference saying it's okay to not treat people if you don't feel that your religion will allow you to treat them. Well, that hospital, based on their religious beliefs, did not allow my mother into the hospital. And my mother almost died. Someone saw her and pulled her in, and they didn't know what to do because it was so late for a C-section. And so the way I got into this world, they pulled my mother, they took her into the, I think she told me it was the emergency room. It wasn't even the delivery room. And she was unconscious by then. And they had to deliver me using forceps. And I almost didn't get here. I almost died. My mother almost died, and that's because of racism. And so my mother shared that story with me and with my family the entire time of my childhood so that she would help us understand what it meant to fight to eliminate racism and sexism and fight for women's health. And so I guess for me personally, I draw like Ayanna on my mother's experiences as a black woman, as one of the first 12 women to integrate the University of Texas at El Paso. I mean, she was a phenomenal woman. And so I think about her as sometimes you get up and say, okay, well, I got to put on my gear again, my fatigues. We got to go to battle again. But it's my mother, you know, and it's fighting for what she stood for, but yet is fighting for the future for our kids. And once you are clear on that, you know, I ain't no way tired. You know, we just get up and keep doing it over and over and over again, and that's who we are as Black women and women of color. It's not an unusual story that I have. Ayanna's story is not unusual. This is who we are. We've just had the opportunity to break through, to get there, and we draw on our personal experiences. We may not talk about them all the time, but we draw on them to know what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah. 2 decades of work every day getting up. I know I'm breaking the third wall, but just a commercial announcement. Your car, a gray Honda Fit, GTY R846. Would you be kind enough to move or switch spots? So whoever can go move your car, and I want to come back to the Congresswoman here because there is this thing about being a strong Black woman. I find it kind of a burden because you know, but when you're in a position of leadership and you're fighting the fights that are affecting people's lives so deeply, how do you balance out having to be strong and get up every day, inviting more and more Black women and women of color into leadership, and you know, just how do you manage all of that? Particularly because you have had such a successful first year in office, but you both have been subject to some terrible attacks. So that's the environment. So tell us more.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you to you and how much I appreciate that in public and in private you create space for us to be seen, to be heard. And, you know, I pride myself on being a lifelong learner, so I am a voracious and avid reader, but every now and then I do find myself watching a reality show. And, you know, recently I was watching, what's the Harris family, T.I., whatever that show is. The rapper T.I. and his family, they have a reality show. And he was, the Harris, I love that show. And because I'm married to a Harris, so, you know, that's what we say, Harris hustle. And in any event, he was organizing a boycott against some designers because they were featuring blackface in their designs. And so they said to him, you know, what's your ultimate goal? Like, what are you trying to accomplish here? It's not just that you want to hit their quarterly sales and show the impact of Black consumers, right? He said, my goal is respect, right? And that just deeply resonated with me because I do feel regularly demoralized and disrespected. And it comes from surprising sources. But when people ask me, are you having a hard time? I'm 6 months in. And I say, well, I'm Black and a woman, so I've been fighting my whole life. I don't know anything else. When people ask me if I'm becoming cynical because of the climate and the polarization and the fact that we are drinking hourly from a fire hose of insult and assault to our senses, our humanity, our planet, our civil liberties, by the hour, oppressive, draconian, family-separating, life-threatening policies are being rolled out. People will ask me if I'm growing cynical, and my response is always the same. I don't have the luxury. But the other thing that I just want to say to you is that when you're marginalized based on your gender or your identity expression or sexual orientation or zip code you're born in or complexion, for whatever reason you experience marginalization, you get a lot of life advice about how to arm yourself to navigate this world. But I think the advice that you don't get enough of, that we don't get enough of, is a three-letter word, and that is joy. When I was sworn into office in January, that was a beautiful day. But the better day was when I went to the community of Roxbury and had a community swearing in where I authored a pledge and I had the community take an oath of office with me because we have to do this work in symbiotic partnership. I won't lift every tenet of that community pledge. It anchors the work that we do every day. But I'll lift 3 tenets of it. I will be bold, I will work every day towards a more equitable, just world. And I will inform joy in my life and in the world, because it is also an act of resistance. I just want to leave that with all of you and ask you to give yourself permission, because even as we celebrate Juneteenth, when we were enslaved and oppressed, we still sang in the fields. We still had joy in fellowship. This administration, this world, they are coming for our autonomy and agency over our bodies, our civil liberties. Please don't give them your joy too. Please don't give them your joy too.
Don't let them take away your joy. I really feel that. My heart feels it. We so need to infuse joy and love into our sense of politics and a sense of possibility. You know, when we first started this conversation, Congresswoman Lee talked about the squad. The squad. Did you know you were joining a squad when you joined Congress? I just was curious.
We should have a whole discussion.
That's a whole sub-conversation.
Let me just say this real quickly. Okay, listen, those are my sisters in service. I love them. Absolutely. We have an alignment of values. We care about a lot of the same policy priorities. We have a kinship of comparable joy and pain because of what our journey has been. But the fixation, to me, is no different than when you see a group of Black and brown kids in a community, you see them as a threat and profile them as being gang affiliated. Whereas when you see a group of white kids in a community, they're just being in community with their peers, right? So within our caucus, there are tons of cohorts and subgroups based upon shared value, shared lived experience, shared policy priorities, but we have been sort of fashioned conveniently as this sort of threat. Make no mistake about it, we came there to be seen and to be heard, but it's not about our squad. It's about the stories and the people that we uplift, that we are inviting in, that we are extending a hand of partnership to. And so, listen, I got broad shoulders and a strong back. I can handle this. I was built for this. But when they marginalize us, when I don't feel this sister gets lifted up and elevated in the way that she should be, that's not just about Barbara. That's not just about Ayanna. That's about everybody we represent and we're bringing along.
That's right. Congresswoman Lee, you are the chair of the pro-choice caucus.
Co-chair. We have two co-chairs,
Okay.
Diana DeGette and myself.
Co-chair of the pro-choice caucus, and I read earlier this week, there was a poll that came out in Iowa that listed abortion rights. Often people don't say the word abortion, but I say it because that's the issue. It's going to be one of the most important issues in the 2020 election, and also a driving issue in the Democratic Party primary, in which we're in the middle of. Both of you have this in common in terms of working on this issue. Because, so to your point about a squad being, there's different ways to articulate it. You as a leader in this major issue, how are you understanding the attack on choice right now? And what are the political solutions and organizing that you're looking to as we're moving into this time?
Sure, and this is a truly defining moment for women's rights in general. First of all, let me just talk just a little bit about Roe versus Wade. This has really nothing to do with whether you support or not support abortion. Every woman should have that own decision, and this is about a woman's right to determine her own health care needs, what she does with her body, not elected officials, not politicians. Women, their partners, their medical professors, their clergy, whomever, that's the decision that women should make. That was why Roe versus Wade is the law of the land. It's the law of the land. Now, in 1976, I was a staffer with Ron in DC, and Henry Hyde introduced an amendment right after Roe versus Wade that said no federal funds could be used for abortion access for low-income women. This is poor women, women of color. I was furious. Of course, Ron didn't vote for it, but it passed. And here we are now in 2019, and what we have now are two systems of government, two tiers of access, not government, access. What you have is the denial of the full range of reproductive health care for low-income women, women of color, poor women, also women based on their zip code. If you don't have insurance, if you don't have funds, Roe versus Wade really doesn't apply to you because you don't have that equal access. So this has been, of course, only one of the big issues that we're dealing with. But years ago, I said, look, I'm going to repeal the Hyde Amendment because this is unfair, it's wrong, and it's discriminatory. And so years ago, I tried to go to our leadership in Congress and say, we've got to deal with Hyde while we're dealing with the global gag ruling and family planning, the denial of contraceptives, what have you, to women. But that was something Democrats said, no, we can't touch Hyde. We can't. I said, but these poor women and low-income women deserve the same equal access that other women. No, but politically it's not the right time. Finally, let me tell you what happened. In 2015, these young women 14 really, around the country formed the All Above All Coalition. They went around the country. These were young, multiracial women. They went everywhere, and they began to educate the public about how discriminatory the Hyde Amendment was. And so they came to me, and we talked about it, but we didn't quite have enough members of Congress clued in yet because they thought it was, about what it wasn't about, really. And so we put it off for another year because our leadership, oh God, they did not like that at all. Now I'm in leadership, so it's okay. They like it, but that's now. But then, so they went back to the drawing board, organized, and so I went to the powers that be, and even with some of our pro-choice groups, they didn't want us to do this. But I said, no, we're going to do this. The time has come in 2015 to get rid of Hyde. So finally, I convinced them that we would introduce the legislation and we'd have some co-sponsors. They thought, and in D.C., co-sponsorship is the way you go. You have to get to maybe 200 before you can even get it heard. And so they thought I'd have 2 or 3. Well, I introduced it with 30 co-sponsors, right? And then each year I've been reintroducing it. So finally this year we reintroduced it again and we have about 135 co-sponsors, right? So we're getting to 200. And what this does is just repeal the Hyde Amendment so low-income women and poor women have equal access to the full range of reproductive health care, including abortions. That's what it does. So Ayanna, in her brilliance, has been working on this for years in Massachusetts. And so when she came to Congress as co-chair of the pro-choice caucus, I asked her if she would chair the task force, right, on abortion so that she could help push this forward. And so she's been very clear on what this means in terms of equal access. And just very recently, you can say what you just did very recently with the amendment, taking it to, go on, because we're working this.
Okay, all right.
What we did last week.
Yeah, but again, let me just practice some shine theory here, which is very easy to do with this one. Because she's so magnanimous. So she nominated me to be the chair of the Abortion Access Task Force under the Pro-Choice Caucus. And so that's why I have that position. I had done work toiling in the fields of Boston, but this happened because she nominated me and pushed for me to have that post. That matters because this is the first pro-choice majority Congress in the history of Congress. We have an unprecedented number of women serving, a number of women serving in their childbearing years. So this has become a real multi-generational effort, because there are women there who remember what it used to be. And then there are women who don't know anything else. And so the fact that we have an impressive number of women serving this multi-generational pro-choice caucus against the backdrop of these draconian policies and threats. In fact, I serve on oversight and reform, and I have been in conversation with Chairman Cummings about doing an oversight hearing to get to the root of what is clearly a strategy beginning in the South to dismantle and chip away at reproductive justice and the health care access and rights of women. Which isn't new to us in this administration, because we see that even with the ACA. It's a pre-existing condition to be a woman, right? In any event, so in addition to pushing for oversight to get to the root of this broader strategy that's happening throughout the country, I also introduced an amendment. Unfortunately, it was ruled out of order, so it won't advance. But just to put a marker down that Hyde's days are numbered, I put in an amendment to take Hyde out of our appropriations package.
Do you remember reading a story 2 weeks ago where the person who's polling #1 running for president was 40-year supporter of the Hyde Amendment? Why do you think I'm not saying names, I'm just saying, did you remember a story? What do you attribute to what you both are talking about, which is that we're seeing a sea change, and Hyde is kind of the practice, the policy around the money. Where do you attribute the ability? Is it a movement thing that's happening? Is it the number of women of color that have been elected? What's changing around reproductive justice that's making it possible or closer to eliminating the Hyde Amendment and securing abortion rights?
Well, I think I give credit to the young women around the country who are doing the organizing. They're the ones changing the dynamic, they're changing the conversation, and they're telling the truth, but also they're leveraging their members of Congress and holding them accountable. And they're not letting them get away with just voting for them, but they're saying, okay, now we got you in, now this is what we demand. So young women, they're demanding that their members of Congress be responsive. But also, I think we have, this all is coming together at one time, because we have now more women of color, bold women like Ayanna coming to Congress who are saying, we're not gonna wait anymore, and we're not gonna let this go down one more year. And so what you have, we have a lot of things coming together, the confluence of a lot of movements, a lot of policy coming together, a lot of new members coming together, and it's all now coming to where it should have been 20 years ago. But now is the moment, and I see this taking off, and it's just a matter of time before Hyde is repealed.
That's right.
It's just a matter of time, so just know that. And finally, I'll just say, I remember, okay, the days of back alley abortions. I remember those days very well. And I know women who died, and believe you me, this is in my DNA. I am going to get this done.
But also, again, what she demonstrated as she walked you all through and provide that historical context and walk through the procedural processes is so important. I'm always just talking to young people about the fact that if you all think that Rosa sat and Martin marched and John crossed the bridge and suddenly, you know, we were seen as full people and had voting rights, that is not what happened. You know, history often gets filtered and sanitized into one dimension. And so you don't know how many defeats there were, how many prayers went up, how much sweat equity was extended, how many starts and stops there were. You know, my mother made sure I knew that the pursuit of justice was a cradle to grave struggle, this pursuit of equity and equality and fairness. And so what she's sharing with you is giving you insight into tactically how we move. And I do think the civil rights movement, which we're still in, it's not bookended, we're still in it, but the early days of it gave us the blueprint. It's to organize, it's to mobilize, and it's to legislate. And so Congresswoman Lee is a lead sponsor on the Each Woman Act. I've introduced a resolution to codify an individual's right to abortion on the federal level, so to codify Roe v. Wade on the federal level. There's other legislation that's been introduced to protect doctors. In my home district of Boston, it wasn't that long ago that a black man, Dr. Ken Edelin, this went all the way to the Supreme Court, was convicted of manslaughter for performing abortion. And so there's legislation that's been introduced to protect doctors in these states, that they not be prosecuted. So my point is that we have to leverage every tool available. Amicus briefs, do what we can in the courts, leverage every tool available to us legislatively, of which we still have many, and we need all of you to continue to organize and to mobilize.
Yeah.
Let me just add one more piece to that, because you asked about one of the candidates. You mentioned the complete turnaround. Well, I want you to know that this is another piece of how we got here. As a result of the last election, we were able to, and I was on the drafting committee of the platform, but it was because of these young women we were able to put into the Democratic Party platform the support for the repeal of Hyde as a Democratic Party platform. So just know what Ayanna said. I mean, there's so many different legs to this, but we're working on all fronts, and that's what women do. Yeah. You work on all fronts until it's done.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I have 40 questions. I'm going to ask one of them. They're all so good. Here's one. There's no name on it, so whoever wrote it, thank you. Young women of color, like 12-year-old Naomi Wadler and 19-year-old Emma Gonzalez, are getting politically engaged at very early ages. So how can we ensure that these voices are heard and taken seriously by elected officials?
Okay, so the great thing about activism is that there is no eligibility age and there is no shelf life, okay? So in that sense, no one has an excuse, because all you have to have is a purposed heart and, and some feet and some hands ready to put in some work. Now, I did propose an amendment in the midst of our debate on H.R. 1 around the reauthorization of voting rights and also other ways to increase access, equitable access to the ballot, right? So in H.R. 1, we talk about Election Day being a federal holiday, mail-in voter registration, automatic voter registration, early voting. In the midst of that debate, I proposed an amendment to lower the voting age for federal elections to 16. Now, I want to say this, because people think like we just pull this stuff from the air. There has been a movement growing nationally, organized by voting rights advocates and young people, to lower the voting age, to make 16-year-olds eligible in municipal elections, in state elections. And two of our colleagues, Jan Schakowsky and Grace Ming, Illinois and New York respectively, had introduced legislation to lower the voting age by constitutional amendment, which was how it was done the last time when it was lowered during the Vietnam War, correct? But I proposed this amendment in the midst of our reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act to lower the age to 16. Now here's why, because I see some of y'all, didn't all y'all clap on that. Now, and I see y'all on Twitter and they say, oh, they're not mature enough, they're eating these Tide Pods and doing all sorts of things. Okay, so first of all, I know many folk, 18 plus, that do stuff just as dumb as that, okay? And they still eligible to vote, all right? So if maturity is suddenly the litmus test, so we got bigger things to debate. Half of my colleagues shouldn't be there, okay? So on the other side, okay, all right? Now, it's to make 16 and 17-year-olds eligible. So just like there are people 18 plus that aren't that engaged, that don't participate at the ballot, this is no different. The 16 and 17-year-olds I know grew up like me. They are working summer jobs. They are working year-round jobs, not for enrichments, not to bolster their resume to be more competitive, because they have to. So they are managing adult burdens, adult threats, adult responsibilities. We are shaping the world they will inherit, everything from the solvency to Social Security, to student debt and how we will handle that, to whether or not we'll even have a planet. They are at the fore of every existential threat, from gun violence to climate change. So I will not condescend or patronize our young folk and say thank you for organizing from Oakland to Parkland to Blue Hill Avenue in Boston. Thank you for your sweat equity, but I'm not sure you deserve to have a stake in our democracy and to cast a ballot. I won't do that. And I'm very fortunate that great voting rights icons and activists from John Lewis to Barbara Lee supported that amendment. Now, we didn't get it into the bill. However, 126 people voted in support of that amendment, and now every 2020 candidate is being asked about it. It really reinvigorated this national debate and discussion. And I get to say it was bipartisan because I got one Republican, okay? So 125 Democrats and one Republican.
And that's quite an accomplishment right now. Yeah. Listen, this has been so amazing. We're almost out of time. We're going to do a lightning round. That means lightning question, lightning answer. Okay. Are we? Yes. Our LGBT community has the Victory Fund. Is there something similar for women of color interested in running for office? And if not, please suggest how we can start one.
There's several. Of course, I have one that, as part of the requirement and criteria for the PAC, top priority, women of color, progressive. And we'll get you the names of the others around the country, because there are some. I don't have the names of them handy, but I do know there are 3 or 4 that we can get you the information.
So we could
definitely
donate
want
to
to
your
lift up
PAC.
Higher Heights. Higher Heights for America. I want to lift up Collective PAC. So there are focused efforts on recruitment and training, but I want to say this. I did just launch a leadership PAC called The Power of Us, and it is equally focused on not who puts their name on the ballot, but the people at the elbow of the people who put their name on the ballot. And I need to just underscore how important that is. We need people that know how to write field strategy, winning campaign strategy, that have cultural competency in communications and policy making. So the bench can't just be about who's running, because we need people to run these campaigns to inform the strategies, but also that will inform the policy making to make sure that it is intersectional. So.
Awesome. All right, we're going to do another round. We're doing great. This one is a big one, so really just a short answer because it's too big. You could just talk for hours about this one. How do you handle the strains of patriarchy as a woman of color in office? The strains of patriarchy. Whoever wrote that, you're a poet. I think it's so big.
My mama wouldn't tolerate it, and so I don't even feel the strains. I just deal with it.
Okay, well, I'm in church, so I'm just going to tell the whole truth. Okay, it's a struggle. The struggle is very real. I could get up here and be cerebral and intellectualize all of it, but it's very emotional, it's very personal, and I'm going to tell you the whole truth. As someone who did my first campaign at the age of 10 to elect the first black mayor in the city of Chicago, Harold Washington, I have been in this, as the kids would say, or maybe I'm sounding like an old lady, but I've been on my grind, okay, for a long time. And I bought into the idea that if I played by the rules, and it brought my full heart to that I would in some way be embraced by this patriarchy. That is not true, because I found that in my campaign. People that I had worked with in campaigns in Democratic electoral politics for decades wouldn't shake my hand in rooms, turned their backs on me, didn't want to be photographed with me. And all because I raised my hand and said, I believe I have something to contribute, and I've earned the right to show up in the world just as myself, and I have earned my stripes. And so I know we don't live in a meritocracy. I was not delusional about that, but I had bought into this idea, and it broke my heart. And so although I'm wearing a Shirley Chisholm pin today, and I lift up her words all the time, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your own folding chair. What I do want to say about that is that right now, this is not about our bringing a seat to the table or even who we bring along. This is about our completely redefining the table and what leadership looks like. We're creating a new table. It's not about us bringing a seat to their table, to their structures, to their rules, to their culture. This is a paradigm shift. This is about shaking the table. This is about being disruptive. Come on. Look at
Amen. Thank you very much. And our final question goes to our very own Congresswoman who has been leading us for so long. And we're so proud to have your leadership. But when we look at the squad who now is in Congress and how courageous and clear in terms of the set of justice policies that they're advocating for in very difficult conditions. My question is, how do we get more? We need more. We need more of Barbara Lee's and Ayanna Presley's and Rashida Tlaib's and Deb Haaland's. We need more. Meanwhile, the DCCC issued a rule that made it difficult for people to challenge incumbents. All Democrats aren't made the same. And some people, particularly women of color, have had to challenge establishment Democrats in order to create a paradigm shift. So my question is, Congressman Lee, how do we have more leadership all over the country to do the kind of work that you have been doing and continue and expand that?
Well, first, the leadership is there. Women are ready everywhere in the country. We're ready. One, we got to get money out of politics. And we got to get to public finance of the campaign. But in the meantime, what we have to do is help raise money, because it does cost money to run. But we can do that by $10 a month. We can do that by finding ways to lift up women candidates and not have to worry about the fundraising piece if women only supported women. I think we can do that, and we can do that today. There are women everywhere at every level running for public office or who want to run for public office, and finances and money is the only barrier. And so we got to get rid of that barrier. And I think we have to figure out ways to raise that money and make sure that women have the resources necessary to run and win an election. Secondly, I think we have to make sure that the powers that be understand, and as a black woman, we have to remind the powers that be that black women are the backbone and the most loyal and consistent Democratic voters and workers, and been toiling in the fields for our party forever. And so it's up to them to support women. And when they don't, we'll let them know what we think, and we'll be there pushing back and beating them back. And I think we've made some breakthroughs, but not enough with our party. And I'm a member of the DNC, and so this is like hard. But we're making some progress. And I think, taking on, like Ayanna did, taking on the power structure and resetting this table is what we have to do. But our time is now. Esther, was it the book of Esther? It's like, who knows, but we have come for such a time as this. I think people around the country and around the world see women and women of color in this country as being the leaders on every single issue, whether it's climate change, whether it's health care, whether it's job creation, whether it's foreign policy. I don't care what issue, whether it's financial services, whether it's holding this occupant, as Ayanna says, of the White House accountable by doing what we have to do. You know, it's women who are leading on all of these issues. And so we have to seize this moment. As Bobby Seale said, we have to seize the time, because this is the moment to break through and to just make sure that women have that support, that friendship, and that circle around them to ensure that they win their elections. Now is the time.
Wait a minute. Let me just be parochial, and I just want to say, please do not take this woman and her conviction and her grit and how she labors in love. I said last night, Dr. Cornel West says justice is what love looks like in public. And this woman fights for justice every day. Please do not take her for granted, and make sure she is decisively returned to Congress.
Yes. Can you stand up with me? All right, here, yes. Please give a round of applause our Congresswoman, Barbara Lee. And thank you, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, for coming all the way out from Massachusetts.
Now, this is the wokest congressional district in the country, so thank you all.